Hi, I'm Bill Kristol. Welcome to Conversations. I'm very glad to have with me today Robert Putnam, Professor of Public Policy at the Harvard School of Government, formerly at the Government Department at Harvard, and a very distinguished commentator and scholar, student of American public life in many different aspects. So thanks for joining me.
It's great to be with you, Bill.
Your most recent book, your most famous book, I suppose, maybe, is Bowling Alone from, when was that, 1999, 2000?
2000, yeah.
That well. We'll come back to that, but your most recent book is called Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis. I think there's a continuity between the two books. So let's just talk about, not so much the books, but talk about America. I mean, what is your analysis of the society, the politics, the culture, but above all, you're an empirical student of American society. Everyone else has ideas and opinions, but you've actually looked at the data. So what alarms you? What doesn't alarm you? What are the things one should know if you're thinking what's up in America?
Well, if you mean by what's up, I know you didn't, but if you mean by what's up, what's going well, there are a lot of things that are going well. And I want to begin by saying that because a lot of what I have to say is what's not going well in America. But over the last 50 years, say, over the period since I was in college, a lot of things have gone well. America's materially better off than we were, have neater cell phones, longer life expectancy, more tolerance for minorities of all sorts, gender, preference. Women my daughter has a lot more opportunities than my sister would have had. Obviously, we've made progress also on race. Not enough, but we've made progress on race. So a lot of things, good things have happened. But I think some pretty bad things have happened, too, over this period. And the two of them that have attracted my attention most firmly are a decline in our sense of community, our sense of connection with one another. And that is what I wrote about in Bowling Alone, the title Bowling Alone obviously referring to the fact that although more Americans are bowling than ever, actually more Americans bowl than vote, bowling in leagues, bowling in teams is off by about 70 or 80% now from the peaks. And that reflects, well, that was the image of the lonely bowler. But the larger picture was that in many different ways in which we could measure these things, people were just less connected with other people in civic activities, within their own family. Family dinners were disappearing and have continued to disappear. In terms of their ordinary everyday life, people had fewer friends, actually, fewer intimate friends.
So the argument wasn't so much a psychological one as a sociological one, if that's the right word.
No, that's right.
That in fact there is less community, not just that people
that's right.
vaguely felt somehow.
Well, people do feel it. And what the book says, you're right. It's not just in your mind. Actually, that's just true. And a lot of, when I published the book, one of the most striking things that happened to me afterwards, lots of people came up to me and said, yes, you've got it right. They didn't know the data, for goodness sakes. They knew that their mom had been in Hadassah, and they weren't. Or their dad had been in the Rotary Club, or in a union, and they weren't. And they conceived that as something that they knew why they hadn't. They were busy. They couldn't do all that other stuff. But they also felt a little guilty that they weren't doing it. And now along comes this Harvard professor and says, actually, it's not you. It's all of us. We're all disconnecting from one another. That was the first place where I began to focus on this change in the degree to which people were connected with one another. Maybe we can go back to the internet, because when I wrote the book, the internet didn't exist, actually, but it came into being almost exactly after I wrote the book. And so people then, often, the natural question is, well, isn't the internet more connection than ever we've had before? So that's an important issue that maybe we can bracket for now. But the larger picture was that we were in fact less connected with one another, both in the big picture, that is connecting with your town or your community, and also in the smallest, most intimate way, less connected with your family, even. And in Bowling Alone, I tried to argue that it's not just that's an interesting fact, it has a lot of bad consequences, because a lot of the way, especially American society, fits together has depended upon what Tocqueville wrote about, in the almost 200 years ago now, about this Americans constantly joining things. And we've been able to run a different kind of society, a less statist society, a more free market society, because we had real strength in the area of social capital, and we had relatively high levels of social trust. We sort of did trust one another, not perfectly, of course, but we did compared to other countries. And all of that is declining, and I began to worry, well, gee, isn't that going to be a problem if our system is built for one kind of people and one kind of community, and now we've got a different one, maybe it's not going to work so well. And one way in which I then talked about it was the idea that we were having a more constricted sense of we. That is, what had once been, when we talked about we meant we, all the people in town. What's a we? I'm not wanting to exaggerate, of course, there were people, there were out groups and so on, but there was a sense of we, and that over my lifetime that had gotten constricted, and so the we became an I. And fast forward, that's 2000. Coming forward 10 years, I then began to think about what are the consequences of that change and other big changes in America for kids.
Just before we get to kids, just curious, and you think, you're biased, but the data both hold up, and obviously there's a huge amount of back and forth and controversy and detailed analysis, your detailed analysis. You think the data from Bowling Alone holds up, and B, is that still has it gotten more that way, or has there been any reversal?
Yes to both. I mean, I'm happy to.
No, I don't know. I'm just curious. Now, I don't need to defend the proposition. I just wanted to make sure.
I can think of things that I've written in the past that turned out not to be right, but this wasn't one of them.
This wasn't one.
I mean, a lot of the history of the debate about Bowling Alone was that I wrote an article before I really had done a whole lot of work on it, called Bowling Alone. And people said, no, he's forgotten soccer leagues, he's forgotten reading groups, he's forgotten all these things. And if you took those into account, there wouldn't be any decline. So I spent 5 years, actually, and got really good data on reading groups and soccer clubs and so on. It turned out when you counted everything, I had underestimated the decline. So I actually think, and I think that's probably now what the consensus, I'm willing to rest with the scholarly consensus. I think the scholarly consensus is there has been a movement toward greater individuation. That's the jargon that sociology would use, but towards
Tocqueville said individualism, so it's not that far from Tocqueville, right?
So the answer is yes, I do, and
it's gotten more that way, probably.
With the one important question about the internet, because the internet is a big deal. The internet is a network, and therefore, in principle, maybe connecting with people over the internet could be just as good as or even better.
Let's not bracket it. So let's take a minute on that. So the counter argument would be?
Well, it's
obviously, there's all these new kinds of communities, online, virtual communities, people sharing interests and hobbies and whatnot.
Well, I think, look, there was a debate for about 10 or 15 years, actually, after the internet came into creation, about whether the internet was real social capital, that is, real connections or not real connections. And that, I think, was a misplaced way of phrasing the problem. I think because nowadays, almost all of our human networks, social networks, yours and mine, and most people's, are simultaneously real and face-to-face, but also electronic, right? Almost, my daughter is a writer and a historian, and I'm a writer and something of a historian, and she writes, or at least did for a long time, lived in the jungles of Costa Rica, and I live in the jungles of New Hampshire, and we're both night people, and we have a lot of email, go back and forth, talking, how's your chapter going, and I'm sure I'm much closer to my daughter than I would be with the email than without the email. I did not meet my daughter on the internet. That is, this is a relationship that has a reality that is not limited to and therefore, conceptually what you have to do is think about connections as alloys. Alloy is a mixture of two metals that has characteristics like, I never remember copper and tin or something. You mix them together, you get whatever, bronze, and it has different properties than either of them separately. we have mixed now real face-to-face connections and electronic connections in ways that create new alloys. They're good for some things. They're not good for other things. They're not all. I happen to be one of the oldest users of Facebook in the world because it was invented by someone who was a roommate of a person taking my seminar at Harvard,
Yeah.
and so my seminar was a beta tester for Facebook, and I've been on it forever. And initially, Facebook was limited to campuses, so all of your friends were real friends. That is, all of your friends were real friends. Then they opened it up to everybody, and anybody who's visible. I'm sure this happens to you. It happens to me all the time. You get asked to be friends with people you've never heard of. And Hans from Berlin last night wanted to be a friend of mine. I have no idea what Hans had in mind. I don't know. Don't even know for sure what gender Hans is. I don't know. Is he planning to meet me at Tempelhof with flowers if I show up? If I get sick, will he bring me chicken soup? So there's been a divergence between friend and real friend, and that represents, I'm not negative about the internet, I'm not. But I don't think you can phrase it in just, okay, well, we're no longer bowling, but we're
Right.
surfing.
Right.
Because there's something we know. I'll draw you a graph here very quickly. It turns out having more friends makes you happier. There's really good research on this. And I can draw the graph. Each additional friend makes you happier, right?
These are real friends.
Real friends.
Yeah,
The graph goes up like this. 3 friends, you're happier than with just 2. 12 friends, you're happier than with just 11. Stops at 20. The 21st friend does not make you any happier than the 20th, but it's going up like that. So the line goes up. Now what's the line look like for happiness and friends on Facebook? Flat. Absolutely flat. Your 400th friend
Doesn't do anything.
doesn't do anything.
Yeah,
The first friend, Facebook friend.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is the internet is really interesting. And it's very early days, so we don't know how it's going to transform. It is transforming our society. I'm just cautioning against the
Doesn't
idea
solve
that
the
it's a
problem.
one-for-one
Right.
replacement of having dinner with your family.
Right. And in some ways it increases. I mean, it's complicated because it cuts both ways.
It does
right?
cut
Yeah.
both ways, yes.
Yeah. Anyway, okay, so there's the problem of the decline of community, which is also a decline of social capital.
Right.
And then you wanted to see what the effect of that on
On
families
kids.
and kids especially.
I mean, there's several big things that have happened in America over the last 50 years. As I say, some of them are good. 3 that I think are not so good are, first of all, the growing income inequality in America. People on the high end have gotten really quite wealthy. People who are well educated have done very well. That's me and you. We've done very well compared to other folks. But people from the median income down have not done so well over the last 30 or 40 years. So that's one trend. A second trend is this decline in social capital, the decline in connectedness. And a third trend is the growing segregation of American society. And this is something that Charles Murray talks about, and Charles and I, interestingly, we have very different politics, but we both agree almost entirely on the facts of what's happened, including the collapse of the working class family.
Right.
And Charles wrote this great book, Coming Apart, that just documented many of those trends, and Our Kids talks about many of the same themes that his book talks about. We differ in 2 ways, I think. One is, which we can get to later, he and I have very different views about what you can do about it. Right. But a second, and in a way more important from my point of view, is I'm focusing on the kids. All of my attention is asking, what difference does this coming apart of American society make for kids?
Right.
And what we found this is what's written what's in the book, Our Kids, is that all of these trends together have meant that kids coming from educated backgrounds, upper middle class kids, my children and my grandchildren, are doing better than ever, right? They're better than their counterparts, 30 or 40 years ago. Higher test scores, better track records. Better, track and field records.
Right.
In every way, they're doing better and better. But on the same measures, kids coming from working class backgrounds of all races in America are doing worse and worse. And that's what Our Kids is talking about. The reason I'm focused on that, a lot of people are talking about inequality nowadays, and they're talking about inequality of income. That is, rich folks and poor folks. And that's relevant, but historically Americans have not cared so much about there being rich folks and poor folks. We figured everybody gets on the ladder. At the same point, you all get a fair start. Some people climb higher. Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, fine. They work harder. They're better climbers. Why shouldn't they be well paid? On the assumption that we're all getting on the ladder at the same place. But we've cared more than most other countries about that kind of equality of opportunity. Do all kids basically have a fair starting point in life, regardless of what their parents did or didn't do? And that is the core. I think that's the core of the American dream. I really do. That everybody here ought to get a fair chance to start in life. And we were never perfect on that, but I think what the evidence says is we're getting worse fast on that. And I think and thought that that ought to be of concern to everybody, not just progressives. Everybody ought to worry if that fundamental core idea that just because you're a kid in America, you ought to get a fair start.
But your concern is not simply that the relative, I mean, obviously, I suppose the kid of two college-educated professionals is going to have a start higher on the ladder than the kid who doesn't have those advantages, but one wouldn't be so worried about that perhaps as long as the kid lower on the ladder still had a good shot to make it up. And but I think your argument is not just the gap, but that actually, absolutely, even the kid lower on the ladder
That's right.
is now facing obstacles he didn't 30, 50 years ago. Is that right?
That's right. And it's not just there's a gap, but the gap is growing.
Right.
And that's why the whole book is encompassed in that. Things getting better and better for kids from educated homes, kids getting worse, things getting worse for kids coming from less well-educated homes. And the kids had nothing to do with it. It's not their fault.
Right.
People joke, the most important thing now is choosing your parents. Well, that's just wrong. I mean, I can joke about it, but at some deep level, that just feels to me deeply wrong. And to go back to the link of the decline in the community, there are many reasons for the growing gap between rich kids and poor kids, many. But the core underlying reason, in my view, is captured in the title of the book. That's why it's called Our Kids. Because when I was growing up in the 50s, in a different world, and when my parents talked about doing things for our kids, we've got to invest some money so that our kids can have a swimming pool. They did not mean building a swimming pool in our backyard for my sister and me. They meant let's pay higher taxes so that all the kids in town have a swimming pool at high school. The term "our kids" meant all the kids in town. And the proof of it was they kept doing those things when my sister and I were long gone. So they were doing it for the other kids in town. But as a result of the bowling alone phenomenon, over the last 30 or 40 years, the meaning of our kids, the meaning of what our obligations are to one another has shriveled. And it's become now focused, when people talk about our kids now, they mean their own biological kids. And if you go back to my hometown and talk about poor kids there now, they say about the poor kids, well, they're not my kids. They're somebody else's kids. Let them worry about them. And that, you see how that sense that other people's kids don't really belong to me? I mean, of course we pay attention to our own kids. I do and you do, and I'm not trying to say that that's wrong. On the contrary, I'm trying to say we ought to have some regard, as Americans historically have had, for all the kids in town.
Now, to what degree does the data suggest that if you're a working class kid growing up in an intact family, I think this would be an obvious conservative question for conservatives who put an awful lot of emphasis on family breakup. That certainly is the theme of Charles Murray.
Sure, and of mine. I mean, I agree that it's a...
But this is an empirical question, though. I mean, how much data, if you are a working class kid from an intact family, does that ladder still look the way it did 30 or 40?
No, it doesn't.
No. So your argument is that it does go beyond.
I mean, I'm going to be falsely quantitative here.
No, it's okay.
But of the total growing gap, maybe a third of it is due to the intact families. And
the differential family breakup.
That's right. And then you still have to ask, well, why is the differential family breakup?
Right, fair enough.
And there's two schools of thought on why the working class family has collapsed. It has. Right. It's interesting. It's an interesting case in social science. There used to be disagreement about whether that was true. There now isn't disagreement that the working class family is really breaking up of all races.
Right, yeah.
And white and black.
And that was controversial, wasn't it?
I know, but now it's not, and it's not even.
It's sad. I mean, if it's true, it's true.
The thing that's even more surprising is there's now pretty broad agreement that that matters. That is, that it matters for kids whether they're growing up in an intact family. That is, it's the stability of the family structure that is really important for kids, and progressives like me say that just as firmly as conservatives do.
But you were saying anyway, before the parenthesis, that only a third, roughly, of the explanation is due to family that make up. So that isn't the bulk of it, or
it isn't. I mean, to put it statistically, if you look at kids coming from intact upper-class families and intact lower-class families, there's a gap.
Wow.
The gap isn't growing. It isn't quite as big once you've taken out that fact, but of course you can't take out that fact because it's an important fact.
Right.
So
that's genuinely worrisome, obviously.
then you have, of course you have to ask, because here's where Charles and I do disagree, actually, where did the breakup of the family come from? And how much of that is the 60s,
Right.
by which we mean whatever we mean by the 60s, the moral collapse and or the welfare system. That's his theory about it. And how much of it is the 80s? That is, how much of the breakup of the working class family is because of the deindustrialization of America, which meant that all those working class guys no longer now have steady employment and haven't had a raise for 30 or 40 years. I think the honest answer to that is it's both. It is partly the normative question, and progressives have to talk honestly about that. It is partly this now 30 years long grinding lack of economic opportunity for working class, less educated guys. And when I talk to thoughtful conservatives, which I do all the time actually, they say, of course that's right.
No, right.
And this seems to me, in principle, this whole problem of the opportunity gap.
And incidentally, since those people have moved conservative or Republican in their voting habits in the last 30, 40 years, it's something that actually Republicans, in a way, feel more probably day to day, in the sense that they're their voters in Ohio and Pennsylvania and stuff. And the disparity between Trump supporters, we're speaking here in January, and more conventional Republican voters is a huge class difference now, and education difference.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the Republican primary.
Absolutely.
So that's, in a way, manifesting.
Absolutely.
A political, I suppose, manifestation of what you're talking about.
And, I think the problem that I'm talking about, which is this opportunity gap, which I know I'm going to sound hyperventilating here, I think that is really just a fundamental problem because it goes to the very legitimacy core of the American state. And that's not just me talking. This is going to be terrible name dropping. President Bush invited me to come to the White House, talk to him about something else, and I did, and then I talked to him about my graphs, and he kept me for half an hour. And I'm not a major Republican campaign contributor. Right. I'm not a major conservative intellectual. Why did he keep me for a half hour? It's very simple. Because if I was right about the growing opportunity gap, that nobody in that building, nobody in that office could dismiss that because it goes to the very core of the legitimacy of our system. That is, this idea that everybody gets a fair shot. So I do think this is a problem that ought to be of interest across party lines, and it's a problem, in my view, a purple problem. By that I mean parts of the problem you can understand most clearly through red conservative lenses. You can see the collapse of the family most clearly through red conservative lenses. Parts of the problem you can see most clearly through blue progressive lenses. You see the closed factories and the shutdowns and the deunionization and so on. Purple problems, there are a lot of problems in the world are purple problems. And the way, in a different kind of America, we would have solved that is you and I would sit down together and I'd say, no, Bill, come on, part of this is really the minimum wage. We've got to talk about that. And you'd say, but Bob, part of this really is the values stuff. We've got to talk more about the values of stable families and so on. And in a realistic world, we would both say, yeah, you're right. Let's figure out how to do that. The problem with this extreme polarization of our politics now is you can't have that kind of a conversation.
I mean, even if we could, I suppose it would be another thing to prove that the policies we might each want to do would do much good. I guess that's another question, which we could get to in a minute. But just to be clear, what you're saying, I think what's powerful about what you're saying is not just there's this evidence of family breakup and or social, lack of social contact and bowling alone. And we suspect this will have bad consequences down the road. It seems to be what you're saying is that what you've discovered, and I think others are on the same path, that it is having, or has had already, bad consequences. It's not that sort of we speculate that people growing up in this environment or people growing up in this society are not going to be in as good shape 20 years from now as people growing up 40 years ago were 20 years ago, if I got the math right there.
Right.
You're saying that you can see the actual evidence.
You won't be able to see it in their lifetime incomes until they become adults, right? So,
Right.
but if we wait to
Definition.
then, it's
Right.
going to be. It is like global warming. I mean, if you wait until you're absolutely certain
Right.
that it's happening, you've lost another 30 or 40 years.
So you do see evidence in, I suppose, school performance, and even in
Absolutely.
income. It's not like people who are 20 or wouldn't be
No.
already. You see the
There's-
effect of this, or incarceration. I suppose what you're saying is, so this is a real problem, not a likely problem we're going to confront in the future. This is like,
No, it's a real problem that we're already confronting, and if we don't get about it soon, it's going to get much worse before it gets better, because this is a problem that has long, deep roots, and you can't turn it around. This is a ship of state that you can't turn around quickly. We're talking about the structure of families. We're talking about the built deeply into our society, these trends are. And so even if you think, as I do, that there are things we can do about it, and when I say we, I don't only mean the state, I also mean churches and other organizations. That's not going to happen overnight. So this is a problem. It's a big problem that I think the country ought to take seriously.
and on the social capital side, is it the case that, I guess this would be a question of confirming your initial hypothesis, that the wealthier types have more social capital and are bowling alone less, so to speak, and that
Yeah.
that's helping keep them afloat, because you said that they're going up, actually, or
Their kids are going up.
the kids are going up.
Yeah.
They don't need or is it they don't need bowling leagues in a sense, and
Well,
it was
let me give
always
a
more
very-
important to the
Let me
less
give
well-off?
a very simple example, actually. One of the graphs that looks like this is taking part in extracurricular activities. So taking part in band or football or chorus or basketball or soccer, whatever, is going up for kids coming from college-educated homes, going down for kids coming from working-class homes. Even sports. And you have to ask, well, why is that? And an important part of the answer turns out to be that 20 years ago we started charging kids for taking part. It's called pay to play. If you want to play football in my high school now, my high school in Port Clinton, Ohio in the 50s, if you want to play football there now, you've got to pay a fee. The nationwide, the average fee for a year of sports is something like $1,600. If your annual income is $160,000, that's rounding error. But if your annual income is $16,000, who in their right mind is going to pay 10% of their family income on football, right? So you might say, well, come on, Bob, worry about something else. Don't worry about kids playing football. But what we know actually is that playing sports and taking part in extracurricular activities has real measurable benefits on lifetime income. Holding constant test scores and college degrees and so on, people who take part in extracurricular activities, not just football, but band and chorus, do better. Why is that? Because they have soft skills, that the market is willing to pay more. They know how to do teamwork. They know how stick-to-itiveness, which is my mom's term for grit. That's what people learn in extracurriculars. So extracurriculars are not a frill. They're an important part of the skill package that all kids nowadays have to have. People coming from well-to-do backgrounds know that, and they're now paying a ton for their kids to have coaches and special summer camps for learning to sing or whatever, and working class people don't. And that's because and this may be controversial with some of your audience, we've privatized the provision of those kinds of services. We've said it's up to the parents to decide if they want to pay for their kids to have those skills. We don't say, algebra. If your parents want you to have algebra, they should pay for algebra courses. Right. But by the fact that it's not that the upper class hasn't suffered from the decline of social capital. It's they've been able to buy their way out of, and I'm talking about me and my kids, right? I'm not trying to talk about somebody else. Yeah. We've been able to buy our way out of this collapse of social connections. Does that make sense?
And I'm just curious, so leaving aside the who provides it, whether it's the public or the private or charitable organizations, and one could imagine all kinds of mixtures.
Sure.
And practical arguments about which way would work better. You could give people vouchers. There are all kinds of market-friendly ways, I suppose, to provide these.
By the way, the leading advocate for fixing this problem in the country is a Republican Secretary of State in Ohio who's trying to abolish pay-to-play in Ohio for exactly the reason that I'm talking about.
And what would be most important, though? I mean, so is it extra activities? That's interesting. I hadn't known that that's such a predictor. Other things? I mean, if you were advising a county somewhere or a city somewhere, or I suppose even a family there, or a church that got a bequest of $10 million, it could spend it on anything it wanted to in terms of helping the families or people in its purview. And what would be what levels does intervention help at? Where would you focus? I mean, it's obviously.
I focus at a lot of levels. This is a big problem. So I'd worry, if it were me, I'd worry about how we can improve the economic conditions of the dads in these families that would enable them to stick with their families, encourage them to stick with their families, and provide more stable homes. That's part of what I would do. I would also wouldn't mind preaching more about the importance of stable families. That's what people on the right are more likely to say, and I think that's fine. I don't object to that. I certainly don't object to that. But then coming away from that question, I think there are a lot of things that the private sector could do. Fundamentally, they involve, the technical term is mentoring, but that means having a stable adult in the lives of these poor kids. The one single fact that you can carry away from any of the stories in our book, because it's not just data, it's stories. Right. The data there too, but the stories, is that poor kids in America are alone. They're just really isolated. They can't trust their families because their families are breaking up. They can't trust their teachers because they're going to very poor schools. They can't trust their churches because they're no longer at church. They can't trust their communities because their communities have fallen apart. They can't trust their coaches because they're not in sports. They lack any caring adult. I know that sounds like I'm exaggerating, but I'm not. They lack this kind of support that you would gave to your children and grandchildren, that I give to my children and grandchildren. They don't have that in their lives. I start with the premise, all kids do dumb things. Rich kids, poor kids, black kids, white kids, brown kids, your kids, my kids. Kids get involved in, get involved in drinking, or they, God forbid, they get involved in drugs, or they make a dumb romantic decision, or they get in a fight with a teacher, or God knows what. When one of our kids, that is the upper class kids, does a dumb thing, instantly airbags inflate to protect the kid from the consequences of the bad decision. So if one of my grandchildren, God forbid, should get involved with drugs, the first thing I'd do is find the best lawyer in town, and the second thing is I'd find the best rehab facility in town. If a poor kid of any race does exactly the same dumb thing, no airbags, because they don't have the same density of caring adults in their lives. I don't mean that often it's a single mom, and often she's doing everything she can to try to hold her family together and earn a living and so on. So I'm not trying to demonize the mothers of poor kids. I am sometimes trying to demonize the dads of poor kids. But the fact of the matter is, these kids, in a way that poor kids in America in the 1950s were not bereft of social support. This is what the feel of what it's like to live in a bowling alone society if you're at the bottom of the heap. So, if I had a magic wand, I'd give every one of these poor kids a caring adult who could provide airbags. Does that make sense? I mean, I'm talking in a million different ways. Yeah. Could provide guidance to the kids, could do what I would do for my kids or grandchildren, what you would do for your kids or grandchildren. It's not like this is rocket science. It's just that there's nobody in their families who do that. Churches historically churches and synagogues and religious communities played a very important role in that historically. I've written a whole book, which we haven't talked about that role of religion in American society. But the churches, whether it's the church's fault or not is a different question, have gotten disconnected from the working class. And there's another one of these graphs just like that. And therefore, if it were in my power, I would say to every clergyman in America, think about not the kids who are already in Sunday school, but the kids in your community who need that kind of caring. And
you would not privilege, if that's the right word, 3-year-olds or 8-year-olds or 15-year-olds. I mean, you would do it at every level, I take it. But is there data that shows it's particularly effective or difficult to intervene
kids need
late?
Kids need different kinds of. Children need different kinds of things at different stages. We now know a lot about early brain development, and we know that it starts very early, and we know that paying attention to kids, reading to kids, really, really young kids, makes a big difference. And so we know that there are huge, really frightening long-term effects of differences in care for kids. I don't mean just custodial care. I mean interacting with them. I mean, in the book we call it Good Night Moon Time. Good Night Moon Time has really a lot of power. And poor kids don't have as much good night. The data show this. They don't have as much good night moon time as rich kids do. So that's the early stages. It's not reading to them when they're 16. It's more providing role models and as I say, airbags to help them. Everybody makes mistakes, but the kids in poor circumstances live in a much less unforgiving world.
And how much, I was talking to someone who's an Army officer, actually, and we were chatting about this set of issues. And he said, well, here's a hypothesis. He said his platoon was full of enlisted. He was an officer, college graduate, but obviously the platoon was full of enlisted soldiers. And a lot of them came from difficult family situations.
Yes.
Because if you're enlisted, you probably haven't gone through college. You haven't graduated from college almost certainly, and you probably haven't, maybe a lot of them hadn't even gone to college.
Right.
And some of them had enlisted because they were in like tough scrapes when they were 17 or 18, and some adult told them, or maybe they just had the thought that the Army or the Marine Corps or whatever would be good for them. And he said their own lives were fairly, by conventional middle-class standards, somewhat messed up. A fair number of pregnancies out of wedlock that they'd been involved in when they were kids, marriages that didn't work out, at age 17 kind of thing. But he said he sort of thought these kids, they would be okay. I mean, he said they're not going to be okay the way we sort of expect a kid to smoothly progress through schooling and through marriage and kids and all, but that it would be kind of a messy situation, but that they would end up, as valuable members of the community with jobs and with families. Maybe they'd be a little messier than the families of, that 50 years ago and so forth. And I mean, that's a nice, A, one hopes that's true, and B, obviously that's going to be true of some number of them. But I guess what you're suggesting is the data are not encouraging about you can't just sit back and sort of think that this is all going to kind of work its way out in the wash.
For several reasons. First of all, I do think that the military has powerful benefits for many kids. I mean, I can tell you stories. I spoke at West Point about this not long ago, and I won't filibuster here, but I can tell you stories about kids at West Point who have been able to turn their lives around. So I'm not on the other side of that.
Yeah, he wasn't making a military point, though. I suppose you could argue that.
No, but it is important.
But it's better for them to have been in that.
It's paternalistic. I mean, paternalistic means, as you well know, parenting.
Right.
But the first thing to say is, because we have an all-volunteer Army, they have high standards, and the bottom 15% of the population couldn't get into the military.
So he's already getting a sort of better.
He's getting the upper half of the bottom third. Can I put it that way? And that means there's a lot of kids down there who couldn't even get into the military, and then there are a lot of kids who don't get into the military. I actually would be in favor of universal service. In fact, I would be, but in the real world, that's not going to happen. So in a way, I'm completely agreeing with what he said, but saying it's a
small sliver.
It's a small sliver. Of what we need to do, and realistically, we're not going to have 80% of all of our kids serving in the military. So we got to have a plan for the non-military.
He was making the point, which I guess that you're saying probably isn't the case, that he wasn't really making he believes, I think, also that the military is a good institution in that way. But I think he wasn't making a military point. He was making a point that maybe we upper middle class people who are more used to a more bourgeois, if you want, kind of family life and career paths. Maybe we're overly pessimistic about the ability of these kids with less fortunate backgrounds to sort of make their own way in a messy way to a pretty decent outcome. But you're saying that
come on.
Well, he was trying to look at the bright side, but you're saying that they're not. I mean,
that could easily have been true in 1950s when people were working in my hometown in the UAW and were working on assembly lines, and they could do well for themselves and do well for their kids. That isn't true now. I mean, it's a fairy tale. And partly because those of us on the upper branch have been getting better and better. We're investing much more in our kids, we're investing more time in our kids, more money in our kids, more and in productive ways. I don't mean just we're buying them things to say go away. No, we're very focused on our kids. And I I know you don't want to be in the position of saying, well, it's good for my kids that we're doing all these things for them, but these poor kids, we don't need to do that for them. Yeah, that's not what you're saying, but somebody has to be worrying about these other kids.
No, absolutely. And final point, we'll move on from this, but now immigrants, I suppose, would be an interesting.
Yes.
I mean, they're interesting. They're part of the country, so they're important, but
Sure.
also interesting as a kind of social science question, because
Right.
you're getting people coming in as,
Yes.
well, not all of them, but a lot of them as adults.
Right.
So I guess you do get a little bit of a snapshot of what the mobility, the possibilities are for economic mobility and for succeeding, in many cases, without some of the advantages of the language.
Yeah, well, I'm
and
focused.
So forth. I mean, what is
the
your-
opportunities. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm just curious what the data suggests about that. Was it better
Well-
to be an immigrant 40 years ago than it is today, and sort of the way that it was better to be a poor kid, I guess, 40, 50 years ago than it is today? Or
No,
is it
the two cases are quite different for several reasons. First of all, immigrant families are much more intact than poor native-born American families of all races. This is not about race.
That's interesting.
And therefore, kids of immigrants are to some extent shielded from the larger for reasons that conservatives fully understand, right? They're growing up in more intact families, or in my terms,
But
they're
it's not an answer to the problem to say, hey, look how well immigrant kids are doing. Well, it's not a crazy point. I mean, if someone says there's no upward mobility in your society, and you say, wait a second, we know in Fairfax County, Virginia, where I live, there are all these people who are the sons and daughters of Vietnamese who came over, who were very poor by definition when they came over, since they weren't invited to take their belongings out of Vietnam or Cambodia, or even people from Southeast Asia and so forth. And they're doing well. But what you're saying is that's fine, that's good if that's the case, but it doesn't really answer the problem you're putting your finger.
No, and while it's true that some immigrant groups, especially from Asia, have the adults have high upward mobility. It's not true for all of them, because all of them don't have the same. They're a self-selected group that is, we get, contrary to what some political candidates have said, we get actually the best Mexicans that come across the board.
Ones who have the ability
Exactly, and they do,
drive.
but they're starting with a very low level of human capital. That is, they don't, most of the immigrants from Latin America who've come in have not been engineers or anything like that. And their first job, probably their lifetime job, is in manual work.
Right.
And their kids are going to do better than the kids of native-born annual workers because their families are more intact. But they're also their kids are starting in poverty. And the poverty part of it doesn't help the kids. So the next generation, do I think immigration is a big success story in America? I absolutely do. You won't find me not saying immigration is an important success story in America. But it's not a way of saying, stop worrying about these other poor kids in America. The immigrants are going to fix it for us.
Yeah.
I don't.
That's interesting.
And by the way, family stability in the second generation of immigrants they revert to the American pattern. That is, the families become less stable.
Right. Assimilation in this respect is bad for them.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. You've alluded a few times to your own youth, and I'm just curious, how did you get in this business? Did you want to be a social scientist, an academic, a professor when you were growing up? What were the key influences and decision points? I'm interested, and lots of people would be.
I described this a little bit in the opening chapter of Our Kids, because I decided to try to do a little bit of a history of my hometown. I grew up in a small town in Ohio called Port Clinton, Ohio, on Lake Erie. Kind of like Lake Wobegon on Lake Erie. Nobody very rich, nobody very poor. This is what it seemed as a child, but also now I know, because I've gone back and done the data. It was a very middle-class town. And very high, I would now say, high social capital. Lots of people. And again, this is not golden glow. I've looked back at the data. High rates of church going, high rates of volunteerism, people connected with one another. And I'll carry the story forward in a bit, my own personal story, but I think I've reflected a lot on because when you get old, you reflect on your own life, and there's a certain sense in which much of my own academic research can be read as saying, I grew up in a really neat time and place. Mm-hmm. It was pretty equal, not a lot of class divisions, not very politically polarized, not even very racist. There was some racism, of course there was, but less than you might think. and a lot of sense of community. And the books that I've written have been just cataloging the ways in which we no longer live in that kind of an America. And I hope that all the data in my books says it's not just Putnam ruminating about this golden age that he grew up in. It's actually, he can show us in the data that America has become less like that and is different. In some ways better, but in some ways worse. Well, I grew up in Port Clinton, went to Port Clinton High School, did pretty well in school, got a fellowship from a local company. So I went to college planning to be a physics major, maybe a chemistry major. I went in '59. And then in the fall of my sophomore year, I took a political science class. This was the Nixon versus Kennedy campaign. I came from a solid middle-class Republican background, so I had actually written a personal note to Nixon saying I would like to volunteer. This is a kid, right? I'm sure you never read it, but I was stuck on the Nixon mailing list forever. I could never get off that.
That's funny.
And I took a class in political science in the fall of 1960. There was a cute girl who sat just in front of me. We just got in the habit of having lunch together after class. There was once, this was the 50s or the 60s, beginning of the 60s, and so there was one time a year called Sadie Hawkins Day when women could ask men out, and she asked me out on a date, and the first date was she would take me, she was a firm Democrat. The first date was she would take me to she sprung this on me after I had agreed to do it, take me to a John Kennedy rally in one of the suburbs of Philadelphia.
Wow.
And the next week, turnabout was fair play. I took her to a Nixon motorcade going right by the. That fall was really was a very interesting fall. I'm still married to this woman now.
Good. That's nice to hear.
55 years later. On the 20th of January, we took a train from 30th Street Station down to Washington. Really snowy day. I remember that snowy day vividly. Stood in the crowd on the east front of the Capitol, because that's where the inaugurations were held then. And I heard with my own ears Kennedy say, "Ask not what your country can do, ask what you can do for your country." And honestly, Bill, I'm embarrassed to say this. Even now, I'm 75 years old, the hair on the back of my neck goes up because I thought he was speaking to me. I know that sounds really corny, but
No,
I was a kid, right?
Yeah.
And I thought, I want to use, I know, I'm embarrassed at how self-congratulatory this seems, but it's just a true fact. At that moment, I said, I'm smart. I want to use my scholarship to try to help the country, not by, building
Spaceships.
whatever. I wasn't anti-war at all, but I didn't want to do it in the lab. I wanted to do it working about social science.
Right.
And so I gradually switched across from biology to psychology to political science to history. Actually, I ended up with a minor in history, and then went off to graduate school and did the standard academic.
So you got interested in politics before political science in a way, or I mean, it wasn't one teacher who got you fascinated.
Well, no, I mean, then once I was in the field, I had really good teachers at Swarthmore. Swarthmore is a very high-quality undergraduate institution, small, so that you had really good relations with your teachers. I happened to have really good teachers, including one extremely good political theorist, Roland Pennock, who was important for me, but there were others too. But remember, I'd come into this whole story as a scientist, so I was very interested in the way societies and polities fit together. But I carried with me from that scientific background the idea that you ought to be able to distinguish between nifty ideas I've just had and whether it was really true, whether this nifty idea was really true. And so that led me to be caught up in the quantitative behavioral, it was called then, the behavioral revolution and quantitative revolution in political science, which was then sweeping the field, and seemed to hold promise of enabling us to distinguish between groovy thoughts that might just be groovy thoughts and groovy thoughts that actually were true, or at least they corresponded to the best evidence we could get. And that's kind of the role that I've meant to be playing in all of my scholarship. I have worked several times I've worked in government, but actually once I was working in government, I realized that's actually not what I'm really good at. What I'm probably better at is sort of trying to think about big questions. I try always to think about big questions, not little toy questions, but to think about them as in my terms, as rigorous a way as I can. That's why there's all these charts and graphs and everything I write, even though I'm in some sense writing in the tradition of Tocqueville.
But the quantitative work is in the service of understanding reality, not so much, it seems to me from reading your work, in the service of, answering some question from within the discipline that the discipline has decided is important and needs to be advanced. So much of social science, it seems to me today, and this is true in all fields, I think, all subfields almost, is now about, it's not about understanding society better, it's about somehow an internal social science discussion of, scholarship.
Oddly enough, you won't know this. When I was president of the American Political Science Association, my presidential address was on exactly this question. And it's sometimes phrased in terms of rigor versus relevance.
Right.
And I reject that because I think you can, at least some of us, some of the time, ought to be working on problems that are really highly relevant to ordinary people, but also in a very rigorous way. Sometimes the internal disciplinary debates are actually quite useful in sharpening our intellectual tools and our methodological tools and so on. But here's what I said as when I was, almost not quite in these words, but this was the idea that I was trying to convey when I was in my presidential address. Professors live an incredibly cushy life. I mean, it's just, if people knew what a cushy life professors live, there'd probably be a revolution. I get paid actually a decent sum for doing what I would do. I would pay to do what I would pay people to allow me to do what I'm doing now. So I live a really cushy life. And that's being paid by taxpayers, and I try to contribute back, but it's being paid by taxpayers and by parents and foundations and so on. Part of the deal ought to be that at least part of the time, our energies ought to be devoted to problems that ordinary people care about. And so I don't think everything that's done in social science has to, just like everything that's done in English literature does not have to be immediately legible to the reader of the Daily News. But some of the time, we ought to be working on problems that my mother-in-law, who's a Western soul, she's no longer with us, but she was very smart and dismissive of academic stuff, Zelda. And I often think, what would Zelda say? Would she think that I was working on an important problem, or would she think this was some academic stuff?
And you yourself have attained great distinction, but I'm curious, do you think generally has political science, or more broadly the relevant social sciences, kind of gone in the right direction? Are you do you look around at what's happening in the prestigious departments and prestigious universities and think, yeah, this is kind of what should be happening? Or do you think, an awful lot of this is, I don't know, not what you would think very intelligent people living very, as you say, nicely supported lives, with the opportunity to teach extremely intelligent undergraduates and grad students should be doing? I'm just curious. I mean, not that anyone has a solution to this or that we want to be dictators. I'm just, but.
Well, I'm as you are. I'm quite pluralist, actually. In my view. My view is you need a lot of people with different kinds of interests in any discipline doing things. So, my work. It's no longer at the front of the quantitative frontier because I'm old, but my work draws heavily. I'm able to say with confidence the things that I did. For example, saying that the family structure was maybe a third of the problem. I'm able to say that, and I didn't mean it in a highly
because you actually
way.
Know the quantitative
because I've done
tools.
The data,
Yeah,
right? And because I and my research team have done the data, and that I wouldn't have been able to do a generation ago because we didn't have the tools mathematically for being able to understand that. So I do think that there's a role for work that is really only immediately readable by other people in the profession. I do think, as I'm now repeating what I said, I do think, however, that as a profession, not everybody in the profession has to do this, but as a profession we have to be driving toward answering big questions. I mean, I got into this field in the 1960s, and 75% of Americans trusted the government in Washington to do what's right most of the time. Now that's sort of it is. 19% of Americans trust the government.
Yeah.
I got into this field, and American politics seemed to be working well, and I have not done my job, I think, because I've not somehow enabled people to understand what's gone wrong. That's what I'm trying to do. I do think some things have deeply gone wrong. I don't mean it's just calculating regression equations, but I do think we have to think about that question as a profession. What's gone wrong, and how could we begin to turn it around? See, this is the one way. I want to go back just a second to this disagreement between me and Charles Murray, who's a wonderful social scientist and a friend. Charles and I have independently come to a very similar, and it's not an accident, a very similar account of some of the things that are going wrong in American society today. We don't agree on all the details, but the big picture we agree on. When I'm asked, well, so what do we do about it? I can give you a list of answers, and they may not be perfect answers, but at least I think we ought to try to solve the problems. And when he and I were on a stage together a year or so ago talking about this, people asked him the same question. He said, I'm a libertarian. I don't do solutions.
Right.
And I'm not now making an argument. I just couldn't say that. I come out of a Midwestern, pragmatic, let's see if we can fix the problems kind of background. And so the idea that I'd be able to describe some big problem that's happening and then say, well, who cares? It's happened. That's not me.
Right. So you have an interest in actually, helping deal with these problems, not simply describing them and leaving it to others who allegedly would know better. Because, of course, that distinction really doesn't exist either, right?
No, it doesn't.
If you understand the problem better, you probably have a better sense of what might work and what might.
Yeah, I don't think, by the way,
not.
I don't think for a second that the solutions to these problems are going to come out of some academic's brain. I think it's going to come out of a lot of people talking hard about it. And in an older American political system, we had the capacity to have a serious conversation about a problem that was not just a blue problem or a red problem, was a purple problem, and try out different ways of approaching the problem. That's what I regret, that we don't have that, at least right now, don't have that culture of having shared problems that we ought to work somehow together to figure out what can we do about this.
And you would think there would be more experimenting even in the private sector and philanthropic sector on what to do about it.
Yeah.
Because you certainly could learn a lot and there are a lot of huge foundations and very wealthy people, leaving aside the federal government even, and there are states that are not paralyzed, presumably, where you'd think you could actually try a lot of things, and some would work and some wouldn't work, but then you'd be much better off. But I don't know.
Completely agree with that. Actually, and I really think the solution, the problem I'm talking about, which is this opportunity gap, is going to come first at the state and local level and then eventually come to the national level. I want to give you one specific example of why I'm optimistic that we can solve these problems, because we've been here before. There's been previous periods in American history when we've had exactly this problem, especially at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, the Gilded Age. Lots of problems like ours, high rates of political corruption, high rates of economic inequality, growing gap between different parts of American society. But then, and this was across parties, we began to solve the problem. I want to give just one particular example because it's, I think, very illustrative. In response to the growing gap among kids, Americans invented the high school. For the first time in world history. It began in small towns in the Midwest, in Kansas and Nebraska. For the first time in world history, people said every kid in town ought to have 4 years of post-primary comprehensive education, the high school. Nothing was happening in Scandinavia or Germany or Britain, anywhere. These folks, farmers and small townspeople, said, we ought to do this. And it was not an easy sell, because you had to say to the local bankers and businessmen and rich farmers who had already paid for their kids to have a private secondary education, who are now off in Chicago making money, you had to say to them, you have an interest in these other kids getting...
So this is the public high school, yeah.
The public high school, right.
Yeah.
Did I say that? I meant to say
Yeah.
the free public comprehensive high school. It turned out to be the best decision Americans ever made.
I
Because
didn't realize that was it. So when is that? This is
1910, plus
is
or
that
minus.
right? Wow.
But it was the best decision America ever made because it did two things simultaneously that economists tell you can't have. First of all, it raised the growth rate of the whole economy, so much so that the best calculations by the economic historians are that one decision, giving a free high school education to every kid in America, gradually it began to accumulate, right? That accounts for most of American economic growth throughout the 20th century. That is, it was a huge effect, essentially doubled our rate of growth. So everybody was better off, and at the same time it leveled the playing field, because the poor kids got it just as well as the rich kids. Economists say you've got to choose efficiency or equity, but that kind of investment was both. It raised equity and raised efficiency, but here's the point I want to make from a political science point of view. It did not come from Cambridge, Mass, or from Washington. It came from folks in small towns in the middle of America trying to figure out how can we solve this problem of our kids here in Topeka or East Elbow. Or
was
whatever.
it mostly at the state level or even the local level?
Local level, spread to the state level, eventually was such a good idea that it spread across the country, and eventually, became normative. And then
Right.
by our time, you think God must have invented the high school, but no. It was
that
invented
is
by
so
people
interesting.
Americans trying to solve a problem very much like the problem we have now. So I think we could do this. It's not like I'm saying America has to become Sweden.
Right.
I'm saying we have to become like we have done in the past.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I've never really read. I should read something about that. I've never read. Is there like one moment where it succeeds and catches on, or is there one proselytizer for it, or is it just a more general
There's
grassroots kind of thing?
There are a number of
I'm sure there are.
books about it. We're going to have to take a minute because I'm having an Alzheimer's moment.
No, it's okay. We can we can revisit and
But
put on.
yeah, I
people
mean,
can
actually,
find the
this is
books.
the one. It's too early to say much more than what I'm going to say now, but I thought that Our Kids was probably the last book I've ever written, but I've gotten interested in how that turn at the turn of the last century happened, and so maybe that's going to be the next project.
I mean, sure, that does sound very interesting, actually. I've not really read this in any careful way, but I don't have the sense that that's been the focus of most of the historians or social scientists who worked on that period. And so, in that respect, it would be very interesting to.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the experts know it's true. I mean, I'm not making this up.
Yeah, but I'm saying, but it's not the kind of, if you just read up on that period, that's not the focus of it in
Right.
normal history books, my sense is, or, in biographies or whatever.
It's so relevant to trying to think how we solve our problems now, which is why I'm now spending most of my time. I do get called by people in Congress and on both sides of the aisle, and by presidential candidates and so on. But really, if the problem I'm worried about, and indeed if the resolution of these big negative changes that I've talked about, the collapse of community and the growing inequality and the segregation of society and the collapse of the family and so on, if we're going to solve those problems, I honestly think it's going to come from decent people in local and state level affairs. I don't even just mean government. I'm working with a group in New Hampshire, which is it's a cross-party group with lots of senior political leaders from both sides of the aisle, and local religious people and local, business people and so on. Their object is to try to narrow the opportunity gap in New Hampshire. Well, I don't mean they're going to do it. I don't know whether they're going to do it, but they've spent hours and hours and hours planning experimental projects. Let's try early childhood education here. Let's try mentoring here. Let's try community colleges here. And I'm betting that out of that will come some interesting ideas, which then may get picked up in, Arizona or Massachusetts or whatever. That's the way Americans have historically solved problems.
Let me ask, sort of, this is related, but slightly different. You've taught for many years, many decades, and seen generations of college students and
Right.
grad students, I guess, come and go. I'm just curious, as someone who hasn't been privy to that on a sort of regular basis for decades, I think a lot of our viewers might be curious. What conclusions do you draw? I mean, I think your own story is so interesting from the late 50s, early 60s of changing your focus and sort of going off on what must have been a kind of unexpected path, I suppose.
Yeah.
And it sounds like your mother-in-law didn't think it was maybe the right path. And what has the sense, maybe this is totally unfair, that the kids are more, I don't know, tracked today and more purposeful, for better and worse, I think, and more less likely to take risks and to experiment in terms of their own careers. Maybe that's not true. I'm just curious what you think and
Well,
what you would recommend to people, some 20-year-olds or 27-year-olds watching, sort of how to think about their own careers and their own public lives as well as their careers. I mean,
Yeah, I have to begin with some qualifications.
yeah, with a caveat that all of this, of course, is whatever. You're not. You'd have to know each kid to obviously give them good advice.
No, it's not only that.
But,
I mean, I do think that has been a narrowing of people's horizons, but that's not their fault. That's because I was coming at a really great time in American history. I mean, we thought this is the early 60s. This is not the late 60s.
Right.
And so we were coming out of a pretty comfortable period. We knew that there were major problems the country had. That was the generation that gave rise to the Women's Revolution and the Civil Rights Revolution and so on. So we knew there was racism, we knew there were problems, but we also thought we can fix this. And we were sort of basically comfortable because we were coming out of an era of prosperity, widely shared prosperity, that we both had an obligation to try to figure out how to solve some of our country's problems, and also had the ability to do that. We were not at all cynical. I'm not saying we were right, but we just, well, I heard, now if somebody said the same thing, went to this inauguration, they'd say, oh, what politicians are always saying that, but they didn't have the almost religious experience that I had, right? That he's persuaded me, and he was a flawed person. I'm not trying to say he was not a flawed person, but the fact of the matter is, I'm so upset that my kids that age now don't have the possibility of experiencing that sense that I did, that I could use my talents to try to help the country. They don't have that.
Do you think they did for a minute in 2009, and people did compare Obama to John Kennedy?
Yeah, I do think they did, actually.
Obviously, people got mobilized, young people got energized.
Right. I do. But we know the country's. I want to make sure I'm not blaming those kids. I'm trying to say they come out of an experience, a much more intense and economically fraught and politically fraught period than I came out of. So it's not like, my generation was great and they're bad. It's that our experiences led us to have one kind of outlook. Look, the kids that I teach at Harvard, I teach my undergraduate seminar in my home, and it's like out of the 1950s, right? We take a tea break, and my wife bakes fresh cookies, and we all, and those kids are just wonderful kids. I would pay Harvard a lot to be allowed to teach those kids, and they do go on.
Harvard doesn't need the money, so don't volunteer it.
No, but I mean, they go on to do wonderful. I'm really privileged, right? So 3 of the people now serving in Congress came out of that little seminar. It's a seminar of 15 people, 3 people in Congress. When I spoke to the White House not long ago, 10% of all the White House staff, senior staff, came out of that seminar. So these are wonderful kids. So I'm seeing a select portion, even within Harvard, I'm seeing the people who are the most interested in solving public problems. So, so now let me put myself in the shoes of let me try to be Bobby Putnam from the 60s, but now I hope I would have enough self-confidence and enough knowledge of history. This is not science fiction I'm talking about. Americans have done these kind of, not every day, and we're not perfect people, but we have actually looked at problems and figured out how to fix them. And that sense is just so missing from our current dialogue today. That, if you're lucky enough to go to college, any college, a good college, a not so good college, if you go to college and finish college, you're automatically in the top third of American society, period. So that's all this talk about college degrees not worth anything, not true. You're going to do fine. Relax a little bit and think not only about how you can make a living. I understand the importance of that. I've got 7 grandchildren. They're all worried about how to make a living. But relax a little bit and think about how you can help the country. And that's what I was fortunate enough to be able to do. It's been fun.
That's a great way in which to end, and I think that's very good advice, actually. And so thank you for joining me today. Thank you for giving that advice, but more importantly, letting people see what it means to seriously investigate these problems and do so with a view towards solutions. Even though I'm a conservative, I'm probably closer to you than Charles Murray on this. There's something a little, I mean, maybe Charles was half joking and of course, or being whatever, didn't want to get into the argument then, but there is something a little, yes, part of America really is feeling that we can analyze these problems correctly, but then do something about them, understanding all the limitations. Bob Putnam, thanks so much for joining me today, and thank you for joining us on Conversations.